Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. Franz, thanks for having me by the house. Really honored to be here. I love the book, Life and Work in Popular Music, Band People. It is the most unromantic book probably I've ever read about the rock and roll industry, but I loved it. It's the realest book because of that. When did you start you're a musician? When did you start to think about these sort of things?
Yeah, people always think about their work, I suppose.
Yeah.
Once they start thinking of it as work, that's the kind of unusual thing I think about band people, about musicians who are not necessarily, don't conceive of themselves necessarily as working laborers. I've been thinking a lot recently about what kind of a worker is a musician. Are they artists who work, or are they workers who work in art?
Yeah.
And I think particularly with band people, there are all kinds of working musicians. There are union musicians. There are session musicians. There are, solo entrepreneurs. What I was primarily, and I talked to all of those types of musicians in the book, but what I was primarily interested in is this funny institution of the rock band, right? That's this combination of small business and creative collaboration and chosen family. That you have to be a kind of idealist to choose that as your outlet, as your way of expressing yourself, and it's a kind of idealism that makes the people who do it and are lucky enough to do it for a significant period of time and make a little money, I think, come later to the idea of themselves as workers than others. I had first started thinking of myself in that context when I started touring a lot for the first time, and touring went from being an occasional indulgence or roving party or exciting thing to do, and more of a feature of my life, of my working life, once it gets to be more than 3 or 4 months out of the year. But I didn't start conceptualizing this book until I came off tour. My youngest daughter was born. My wife had just started a demanding job. It wasn't, I came off the road and it wasn't clear when I would go back on or if I would, and it was a little bit of an identity crisis, but it was also an opportunity to sort of to pause and get some perspective on what this thing was that I had devoted the first 15 years of my working adult life to, and try to identify who was this community that I felt myself to be a part of, what were the guild skills of that community, what were the points of pride, what were the points of frustration.
And so when do you think musicians start to think of themselves as workers?
Well, I think it depends on how you come to it. So if you come through professional training, right, come out of conservatories, come out of Berklee School of Music, Juilliard, you're much more likely to come out thinking of yourself as a worker in that sense, because like all professionalizing, credentialing institutions, that's the intent, right? They're going to turn out professionals in a field.
Gotcha.
And so you're encouraged to think of yourself as a professional. That can mean different things, right? So if you go to Juilliard as a violinist or a pianist, if you come up through, the competition circuit, right? You're encouraged to think of yourself as a soloist, I think.
Okay.
In the same way that if you're a professional athlete, you've come up through a situation where you were probably the greatest ever athlete to come through your high school.
Definitely.
But you may end up being a bench player
Right.
once you join the pros.
Right.
And you win as many concerto competitions as you want as a 15-year-old violinist, but your most likely professional job is a second chair in a regional orchestra.
Right.
And so I think so there's that aspect of it. But you are going to think of yourself as a professional. Now, people who come up through band culture, through DIY and indie and punk are much more idealistic, and, selling out doesn't have the same sort of imprimatur that it once did decades ago.
Right.
I think there still is a slight sense in those circles that it's a little embarrassing to think about money, to talk about money, to think of making a living, to the extent that's even possible with a band in the 21st century.
Right.
But that's not the first priority. And so people who come up through that circuit come much later to the idea that this has become a career for them or a vocation for them.
It was interesting. You talked about the folks in indie rock tend to come from means, and they don't have to think about money in the same way. And I always thought, back to like Aretha Franklin and Chuck Berry, who would demand to get paid in cash before they would even get on stage.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a racial component of that too, right? To be suspicious of exploitation,
right,
by unscrupulous promoters is. But yeah, I think by and large, the old name for indie rock, when it first emerged of the ashes of punk rock in the early most was college rock.
Right.
And in a way, that's a much more descriptive term because it speaks to the demographic of the kind of people who are most likely to be attracted to it, consume it, perform it.
Right, and REM being the early archetype of the college rock.
It's funny, I just wrote a review for the Wall Street Journal of the REM bio that just came out that deals with exactly this.
Right.
That, the reason, if you read the REM biography and the Replacements biography back to back, they create an interesting Rashomon, right? Where behind the scenes, both bands were partying just as hard. They're getting into as much bad behavior, but the Replacements in their book talk about slightly resenting REM because no one perceived them as fuck ups because they were too smart. They were smart enough to keep it under wraps and behind closed doors in the way the Replacements weren't.
Right.
Because they were REM was basically nice college kids. And they were polite to each other. They showed up to their recording sessions on time. They, for all their sort of performative ambivalence around success, they did eventually do all the promotional things that were asked of them. And they had an emotional intelligence and sort of expectation. They were able to perform in the way that, like, the middle-class children of professional families can do in those situations. And I think indie rock is characterized by that. To the extent indie rock is an interesting term because it's one of the few genre terms that refers to the means of distribution and production rather than anything inherent in the music itself. Keith Harris, the writer Keith Harris, wrote something which I think about a lot, which is that the younger practitioners of sort of like idealism around rock and roll in the 21st century are more likely to use the term DIY than indie.
Okay.
Because the independence of indie rock in terms of its, to use the sort of Marxist financialization of it, it's much more, it's much harder to justify the independence of so-called indie rock in terms of its independence from organized capital. Right.
Is Matador that much of an independent label? And
it is not. Right. Like, when Warner Brothers buys 49% of Sub Pop, what's independent about that?
Not much.
Whereas DIY refers more to the labor, and I think there is the kind of labor that is going into producing the music, and there's much more awareness in the 21st century because so much of the capital has receded from rock adjacent music. There's much more awareness of music work as cultural labor, because having a band is much more like operating a responsible small business than it is, operating a bacchanalian orgy.
Especially these days. I mean, have you found that things, there was the idea of the busting up hotel rooms of the 70s and 60s. Is it different today in terms of just the health, the approach?
Again, it's about the money,
Yeah.
right? The canonic rock stars of the 60s and 70s were insulated from accountability because of the giant pools of money. They could hire people to clean up their messes, and bands these days don't have that. Any band that you've heard of, by the time they get to that point, has demonstrated a baseline level of responsibility in terms of renting the van, getting the insurance, ordering the merch, keeping tallies of the merch, settling the shows at the end of the night.
And you said in your book that responsibility often falls to the band leader.
It depends on the organization of the band, right? If it's a nominally democratic band, a lot of times those jobs get distributed. Especially in those early years before, bands can afford to hire their first, often the first employee is a sound guy doubling tour manager.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then the first volunteer is a driver / merch person. But before you have those people, maybe somebody in the band handles the merch, somebody in the band handles the hotel booking, somebody in the band handles advancing the shows. Now, I talk about the different kinds of political organization of bands that you can have: aristocracy, monarchy, or democracy. Right? Where monarchy is one person's the band leader, and they're more or less hiring the rest of the group, whether that is officially hiring in terms of payment or everybody understands who's the band leader and primary songwriter, right? It's a band in sort of name only from a creative standpoint. In those situations, the band leader is going to be, if they can't afford to hire a tour manager, is going to be the de facto tour manager, which is a lot to ask, Aristocracy being, maybe there's two of those people, right? Canonically, the singer and the guitar player. And democracy is where it's more spread around, and those roles might be more spread around. Sometimes you have support musicians who are more assertive around that sort of thing, or just sort of like dealing with that sort of thing, or just happen to have a good head for numbers and so volunteer to deal with that sort of thing out of a generosity. Janet Weiss in the book talks about how she likes to handle the set lists, even if it's not one of her band. She loves, some people will just volunteer. Mike Sneeringer, drummer, talks about volunteering to be a sort of de facto tour manager and then accepting a nominal pay just because he happened to know how to advance shows and do this sort of financial planning.
Does a person increase their currency within the band if they're able to take on those roles outside of the musicianship? They become less hired guns and more, an integral part of the working small business.
Of course, the more you can do, the more valuable you are.
Right.
I mean, that goes as much for being a multi-instrumentalist as for knowing how to deal with some of these other in the same way, you hear these jokes about people getting hired into a band as a teenager, not because they were a great bass player, but because they had a PA.
Right. Right.
Sometimes, some kinds of bands love to hire if they know someone's sober, it's great to have a sober driver at the end of the night.
Sure.
That can be helpful.
Right. One of the most striking things to me about the book was the absence of democracy, and you talked about the authoritarian but democracy. It's often folks in the book are saying that it's not really possible within a band.
Well, it's possible. It's just harder. I think, and again, it goes back to that idealism that drives young people towards the romance of a band, right? To the extent that people have experiences with genuinely democratic bands, they tend to be their early bands when they still have that sort of all for one for all aspiration.
Yeah.
People who are more veteran musicians have, I think, by and large, have come to prefer that one person at least have the final say and be able to sort of articulate a vision for the project.
Yeah.
because it's more efficient that way. But, the romance of the demo, I think I say in the book something like people still long for that idea. The hierarchies tend to emerge from outside pressure, I would say, as much as from internal jockeying for position. So a fully democratic band might start to get some attention, and then the pressures of the audience, press, and management can tend towards inducing a hierarchy. Management and booking find it easier to deal with one or two people.
Right, as opposed to reaching out to all four, and somebody's got to be a decision maker.
Trying to organize a time when everyone can meet, trying to schedule a conference call is hard to do. Trying to get people to hash out a decision is hard to do. It's time consuming. Fans, by their nature, will focus on front people, lyricists, and that has a kind of gravity to how to in terms of attention. Press have a similar kind of incentive, but also, it's easier to schedule one or two people for a photo shoot. It's easier for graphic designers to work around one or two faces on a magazine cover than a bunch. There's more room for the other headlines. Maybe you want to talk to the lyricist because people, lyrics are language, and they're easier to talk about than music. They're easier to ask questions about. They're easier for fans to identify with, and they're easier to quote in an article. Right. And so all these things. You look at a band like Fugazi, right? A archetypically democratic band.
Yes.
Fiercely defended the democratic quality of their band internally. But who's the one person that everyone knows from Fugazi? It's Ian MacKaye.
Right. And was the Minor Threat? Was the original band, or
there was Ian's band before that?
It was Minor Threat. I remember. I think I still have this during the CD era. On the back of this CD, it said, "This CD is available for $12, postage paid," and it was the Washington D.C. address. I mean, they were.
Yeah, you can still go to that house, and people do.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And you talked about some of these bands that are democratic were those that formed very early on when the people were young. And I mean, you write in the book U2, REM, Radiohead.
Yeah, so these are the really canonic examples that exert a particular fascination among band people because they're the bands that decided before there was real money at stake that they would split the money equally, and crucially, the songwriting credits equally.
Wow.
Right? This is where the class system traditionally emerges, because songwriting credits are an extra income stream that accrue to singers, primary songwriters that aren't shared with the rest of the group necessarily. U2 and REM and later Radiohead made the decision that they would do that, and the result is that they all got equally rich at the same time, and I think not for nothing have had these multi-decade careers with a notable lack of acrimony, and I think that's related, right?
Sure.
Like if you read a lot of rock bios, like band people tend to do, you notice that how much of the acrimony revolves around songwriting credits and how much it creates a class system within a band.
And can you talk about the songwriting versus arranging?
Yeah. Songwriting is the intellectual property, is one form of this gets a little bit in the weeds and people tend to nod out
but it's super important because this is where the money's at.
It's super important if you want to understand why bands have problems and break up.
Yeah.
There's two kinds of intellectual property in rock and pop music. One is about the recordings. That's called the masters, the master recordings. And one is about the song in the abstract. So, for example, to take a classic example, Bob Dylan owns the songwriting credit for All Along the Watchtower. Jimi Hendrix or Jimi Hendrix's record label would have owned the master recording of his version of All Along the Watchtower.
Right.
And the way the legalities of songwriting copyright were established in the late 19th century were in a time where there was a separation between performer and songwriter. You had professional songwriters, often professional songwriting teams, right? Gilbert and Sullivan.
Lieber Stoller.
Much later.
Yeah.
But yeah, somebody's writing the lyrics, the other person's writing the music, and then they hand it off to professional performers who perform that music.
Right.
Aside from a few exceptions like Noel Coward, there was no expectation that performers would be performing their own material. That doesn't really come in until the rock and roll era. And it doesn't become an expectation of bands until the British invasion, specifically the Beatles. But the point is that that songwriting copyright ends up being based on what you can capture on a piece of sheet music. So melody, chords, lyrics. Arrangement is, it's a little bit complicated, but it's basically not legally protected.
Okay.
And so it becomes an awkward fit to map that onto the collective creativity of a rock band, where you have 4 or 5 people in a room looking at each other and creating the artifact.
Yeah.
Specifically, it becomes a problem for drummers, because drummers in the average rock band are not creating any of the parts that are legally protected by songwriting copyright.
Right, it's rhythm, or it's melody and
lyrics,
melody and
roughly
lyrics.
speaking.
Okay.
You can't copyright a chord progression.
Right.
And so drummers are structurally excluded from songwriting credits. And songwriting credits are an interesting kind of income stream because they continue whether the band is active or not. So your band breaks up, you stop touring, you stop selling records, but you have a song that's still on the radio. The members of the band whose income is based on ticket sales, merch sales, record sales no longer have a significant income stream. But the songwriters, because the song is still being played on the radio, do. And so it's becomes like a 401k.
Right. And they call that mail money.
Mail money, yeah. The checks that come in the mail now it's direct deposit money, I guess. But the term remains.
And so the masters piece, talk about the masters, because I know, that was something with Taylor Swift had re-recorded all of her early songs so she could have, I guess, the new masters.
Yeah. That's the recording.
Okay.
And so you can record the same song as many times as you want, and each one of those is a different master recording. And if you paid for the recording, then you own the master. If your record label paid for the recording, the label owns the master.
Wow.
And it depends which recording becomes the canonic recording, determines which master recording is more valuable than another.
You talked about drummers and how they're often left out of these residuals. Can you talk about the different instruments within a typical rock band?
Yeah, well, bass, drums, guitars, sometimes keyboards, depending on you don't need me to define the typical rock band.
And where do they fit in the hierarchy? You talked about there's the holy trinity of bass, drums, and guitars, and then of course you have other instruments, pedal steel, piano.
Yeah, as a keyboardist, the role of keyboards in rock and roll historically is of considerable interest to me. Right, the piano is at the root of rock and roll. From ragtime and barrel house piano to the influence of piano on Chuck Berry. Johnny Johnson was a barrel house blues pianist, and the dun da dun da dun da dun da dun da dun da blues barrel house piano left hand mapped onto the fretboard of the guitar becomes the iconic Chuck Berry rhythm guitar. Dun, 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 right? And as has been pointed out, that Chuck Berry's songs are not in the traditional guitar keys. They are in piano keys.
Wow.
And so between that and the early influence of people like Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, obviously piano is, and I think a lot of people forget the influence of gospel.
Definitely.
And the particular doubling in gospel of acoustic piano and Hammond organ. Right, so all this is that gets brought back by the band in the persons of Garth Hudson and Richard Manuel, and then codified as sort of a retro thing, I think, by the E Street Band. So keyboard and piano, particularly, is such a crucial part of the history of rock and roll. In the reaction to prog rock and synthesizers in the 1970s, with punk rock and hardcore, because that kind of keyboard was so associated with grandiosity in 70s stadium rock, it gets a bad name.
Gotcha.
And then because hardcore punk and then college rock / indie rock becomes the foundation of alternative rock in the 90s and the early aughts, there became this perception for decades that keyboards didn't belong in real rock and roll.
I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up. I'm not a fan of prog rock, but I mean, it's had a profound influence, it sounds like, on modern music in that it created a reactionary.
I think more of an influence in the reaction than in itself. I think some of that has melted away a little bit as that sort of like Gen X purism has begun to age out of the system. But it was certainly very much there when I started as a rock keyboardist. And then, I talk about in the other book the complicated position of playing a non-canonic instrument in a rock context. Right. So Stuart Bogey, who's a really talented multi-woodwinds player, talks about how, he picked up the clarinet as an elementary schooler, became a really serious clarinetist. But as a teenager, he got into punk and hardcore, and he wanted to rock. But he played clarinet. Yeah. So what are you going to do? It's so frustrating. He's found a place for himself. But yeah, some of these early choices determine your structural position in ways that you can't predict.
And how about the bass player? You described the bass player as having a sense of humility, that they're never the front person.
Yeah, bass players, I think, not to overly generalize, but I would say the bass players that I spoke to were the ones who were the most comfortable with their position in band hierarchies. But that's sometimes that can be a personality thing. That's a chicken and egg. Right. Question, right? So Mike Watt in the book talks about how he had internalized that perception that the bass was sort of the redheaded stepchild of the group, but that in talking to his musical partner Dee Boone in the Minutemen, they really as part of their political program were interested in overturning what he called the political economy of the band. So influenced by the very active role of the bass in R&B and funk, in Motown and funk bands, where the bass is playing a real melodic role.
Right.
They wanted to have a band where the bass was the lead instrument and the guitar, again, influenced by funk, the guitar was a kind of a rhythm instrument. So that's also out there as a possibility.
Yeah. I mean, it is, the indie rock, it is definitely more guitar-driven, whereas in the R&B funk world, the bass just is much, much more prominent. And I
don't know what you can call indie rock at this point.
Right, that's true.
Right? I would say indie rock in the 21st century is as much driven by production techniques as anything else. And the assimilation of techniques from pop music, drum programming, synthesizers, soft synths. I think indie rock in the 21st century has as much to do with Max Martin as it does to do with Fugazi.
And who's Max Martin?
The Swedish pop producer who wrote a lot of the turn of the century hits for the Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears. And
gotcha. Okay.
So on.
He has a studio in the city, right? I think
I'm sure he has studios all over the world.
Studios all over the place. So talk about you talked about the being a good musician versus being a good hang.
Yeah. This is one of the core. So when I was thinking about what makes a good band person, what are the skills? What are the core skills? And one of them seemed to be social as much as musical. So you'll hear people say, when you're on the road, you're only on stage for an hour and you got to hang out with each other for the other 23. So, of course, it's better to be someone that you can get along with than to be a transformative musician, which has a sort of obvious quality to it. But and a lot of people that I talked to sort of reiterated that or defaulted to that, and with that kind of humility of like, yeah, you think I get all my work because I'm not because I'm such a great player, but people like having me around. And that makes a kind of sense. But I think I would caution musicians to put too much stock in that, because you run the risk of a couple things. You run the risk of turning musicians into politicians. You run the risk of eliminating the artistic personality and forcing people, if everyone feels, so a couple people in the book talk about the pressure of the hang. Like sometimes you just want to go back to your hotel room and read a book quietly and not feel like you have to party and hang out. And I don't think you want to exclude those kind of musicians necessarily. Obviously, you don't want assholes.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that it can tend, I think, sometimes to recreate some of the structural biases of a profession. So if you're hiring a band, if you're in a position of hiring a band, and you want people who are going to be a good hang, quote unquote, in a lot of cases that means people who share your assumptions about not just music, but about the social world of rock and roll. And I think this comes into play when you talk about the gender inequities of rock and roll, and why more female musicians don't have longer careers. And if you talk about being a good hang as being equivalent to sharing assumptions about behavior, let's say, if you're someone who objects to the ambient misogyny and sexism of rock and roll, and objects vocally, does that make you a bad hang? If you don't, and does that, and is that something you want to think about?
Is that less of an issue in terms of the whole hanging out piece as a band gets bigger and wealthier, and that you're no longer in a sprinter band? You have tour buses. You might have multiple tour buses. You're not sharing hotel rooms.
Yeah, obviously there's less of a pressure for that. Tour buses are pretty cramped as it is. It's not like you're not literally sleeping on top of each other if you're in a tour bus.
Fair enough.
I think a lot of people at my band's level, which is sort of mid to upper tier indie rock, but not rock stars by any, worked our way up, saw the tour buses as a goal, worked our way up through vans to tour buses, and then have come to the decision that actually the tour bus and a hotel room is the way preferable. That we don't want to do tour buses anymore. Anyway, that's a little bit of a diversion. You were saying, the question is about bands at the huge level of success. Does getting along matter? It matters in the sense that when you're talking about whether you prioritize being a good hang, that mostly applies to situations in which a band leader or leaders are in a position to hire the people they want to. And this comes back to that question of external pressures on a band. If you're in a band with a set lineup that an audience becomes attached to, it's not so easy to replace members if there becomes a personality conflict, right? People want to see original lineup or canonic lineup,
right?
Even if you don't get along with them anymore. And so emergent ego problems or addiction problems or just people who are sick of each other. The question of good hang versus crucial musician is no longer on the table.
Right. It's all about, can we still get the money? Right. I think Oasis is going back in the two brothers don't get along.
Sure, yeah.
But you can't replace either of them.
With the brother question, the sibling question, one musicologist that I quote in the book says, for all the cliche about a band being like a family, it's notable that bands that feature actual family members never use that phrase. They don't ever say that. Of types of support musicians. You'll notice that I'm not using the term sideman, which is what a lot of people default to. I think, I spent a lot of time when I was working on the book looking for a different title or a different term.
Okay.
And I've settled on using, band people obviously is the title, or support musician, right? So that, because sideman has this implication of hierarchy that's not always applicable in addition to the gendered nature of it. Taxonomy of support musicians, sure. And most musicians will operate in several of these categories over the course of their career, if not simultaneously. And that has to do with, I'm writing a piece about the history of musicians' unions right now. And one of the challenges of collective action for musicians and musicians' unions in the legal sense is that a vanishingly small percentage of musicians do one job for their entire income, right? This seems sort of self-evident. Most musicians are piecing it together.
Yeah.
But unions are best capable of dealing with and organizing musicians who have a single employer, which is why, the unions that survive in the 21st century are the ones who are either industrial unions, right, Hollywood or Broadway, or can deal with a single employer, NBC TV, right. And it's been a continual challenge for unions to organize musicians, the bulk of musicians who work for in multiple roles, and in terms of the people who are in the book, that means a musician who's a full member of one band is a touring member of another band. When they're off the road, does some sessions, maybe fronts their own group sometimes, or does a solo singer-songwriter act, and is sort of moving between these roles of full member, employee, band leader, solo entrepreneur, et cetera, et cetera.
How have people been able to scrape together a career? I mean, has it been all of the above that you found in the people that you've spoken with? Yeah,
I mean, by definition, there's a sorting process. There's a Darwinian sorting process in the field.
Yeah.
And the people that I spoke to, by definition, I wanted to speak to people who were career band people. And so they were going to be people who were in their 30s at the youngest, really, right? You have been at it for 10 years or more. And again, by definition, they are people who have managed to make it work. When the New Yorker review of the book came out, which is, of course, I was thrilled and honored to have, I wanted to push back a little bit on it because it was framed, at least in the web version, as a story about decline and the unsustainability of the career of the working musician. And I actually think that the book, again, almost definitionally, is a story of survival.
Yes.
It's the people who have managed to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And why? And then it becomes a question of how did they make it work, and what kind of person can make it work.
A lot of the book, people talked so much about how lucky they were to be professional musicians. I mean, does that play a part in the unwillingness to maybe ask for more, or to feel so grateful to be working as a musician that they're sometimes their own worst enemy when it comes to negotiation? And
Yeah, 100%. I think there's a certain feeling of obligation that you have to pay lip service to how lucky you are, right? Okay. Because so many people see it as a dream job.
Yeah.
I think at the same time, I do think a lot of musicians genuinely feel that, right?
Sure.
You have to want it. It's too hard of a job to not have to really want it.
Yeah.
And to feel lucky to do it. But I do think that it creates a rhetorical problem, both for musicians who want to express the difficulty and challenges of the job, because there's always going to be a certain segment of the population who feels like that you ought to just be grateful that you get to do it. There's going to be a segment of the population who resists thinking of it as work, right? Even the word, we play music.
True.
Right? And there's going to be a certain segment of the musical population that always feels a little, I think, again, like I said, genuinely uncomfortable about thinking of themselves as workers for those reasons. And I think that does contribute to the self-exploitation, or the ways in which musicians allow themselves to be exploited, because of that sense that, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life.
You talked, maybe you could talk a little bit about tension, about talent within the bands. And you had mentioned the tale of, I guess, the two Stewarts, Stuart Murdoch of Bell and Sebastian.
Yes. And Stuart David, also of early Bell and Sebastian. Yeah, this is one of the most fascinating books about music. I should reread it, because it's begun to loom so large in my memory, because it was a kind of book. I'm not even sure anymore if it's a good book, but it was a kind of book that I had never read before. The story is that it's a memoir called "In the All Night Cafe" by Stuart David, who was the original bass player in Bell and Sebastian. It's his memoir of the early years of the group, in a sort of very familiar post-collegiate Glasgow bohemian scene. David himself is a songwriter, has a band. Anyone who's been in one of these urban bohemias,
I used to live in Glasgow. So.
Yeah, all your friends or whatever, Brooklyn in Williamsburg
right.
in the aughts,
Yep.
Soho in the 70s, wherever your personal reference point is.
Right.
All your friends are artists. Everyone's doing cool, creative stuff. Everyone's a genius. Everyone's going to make it, right? You join a bunch of bands if you're a musician. And what emerges over the early years of Bell and Sebastian for Stuart David, and he sings a few songs on those early records. Murdoch writes the bulk of the material, but Stuart David sings some songs. Isabel Campbell sings some songs. It's as these things go, a relatively democratic band. But the fans and the press and the label are increasing. It becomes increasingly clear to Stuart David that while he thinks he's a pretty good songwriter, everyone else thinks he's in a band with a genius. And the question becomes, can he come to terms with that fact? Or is that not, in the end, going to be
viable?
A problem for him and his own ambitions.
Yeah.
And he does end up leaving the band,
right.
And he does a couple of his own records and ends up pivoting to being a writer, and quite a good writer, it seems like. The drummer in the band makes a different choice, and becomes the right-hand man to Stuart Murdoch, I believe, to this day. Similar thing happens in the Tom Petty band, right? One of these bands that makes a transition from being a relatively democratic band to being Tom Petty. to being Tom Petty.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And the Heartbreakers, but really Tom Petty.
Yeah.
You know, and different members of that band have to make different accommodations to that. You know, for the drummer, it becomes he rebels against it and it eventually leaves the band. Guitarist Mike Campbell famously again becomes one of these like loyal lieutenants.
Yeah. And you talked a little bit about family, and you have 2 children, and how did the rock and roll world change for you? And you alluded to this a little bit earlier in our conversation once you had children.
Yeah, I wrote an article for Slate a few years ago about parents who tour with their children, and I used a portion of that in this book. But a lot of it wasn't relevant because parents who tour with their children, almost by definition, tend to be the band leaders, because they're the ones who can dictate the terms of the tour.
Yeah.
They're the ones who can hire a tour nanny. They're the ones who can say, "Hey, everybody, new deal. Kids are in the van."
Yeah.
In a way that
Right.
a support musician can't do that. And so support musicians have a much more conflicted relationship because if they want to continue, especially their touring career, they're going to be away from their families a lot.
Yeah.
They're going to have supportive partners. They're going to have to make enough money to justify being away as much.
Right.
I think any creative parent has found that they become more efficient with their time, right? You don't have the whole day stretching out before you in which you can get an hour or 2 of creative work done.
Yeah.
You might have the hour
Right.
while the kid's asleep.
Yep.
If you're lucky.
I mean, I've often heard if you want something done, give it to a busy person. And when you're a parent, you become that busy person.
Yeah, somebody in the book talks about, putting the pasta water on to boil and then running back to the office and overdubbing a guitar part.
Right.
So there's that aspect of it. I think there's an aspect of becoming, exerting a little more triage around the work that you take. Because any work you take, it becomes a zero-sum game, right? Any work you take is going to be less time you spend with your family, so it has to be really worth it. You can't take these sort of what does Nels Klein call it? Failure runs, tours, just to be on tour.
Right.
You might want to do only the 5 shows are going to be good instead of the other 22 to fill in around it, where you're just like, God, there's 5 people here. What am I doing?
Yeah.
And then FaceTiming with your kid who's like, when are you going to come home?
Right. Yeah. So you don't talk much about yourself in the book. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about your career. And you were in the Hold Steady, and then there was a 4 or 5 year period where you weren't, and some of the projects that you've been doing, and now you're on faculty at Bard.
Yeah. I was under some pressure to put more of myself in the book, and I really didn't want to, for a variety of reasons, one of which is that I wanted to outline a community. And part of that process was answering a kind of question for myself instead of talking about myself. And it was a way of talking to other people who I considered my peer group, or, broadly drawn, about the kind of conversations you don't always get to have. About, hey, here are situations that I think we've all been in, and I know how I handled those situations. How did you handle them, and what can I learn from that? My career, very quickly, I moved to New York when I was 17. I went to NYU as a music student in jazz performance and classical composition. I came out and did I took every job I could, a variety of work, as one does, sort of throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. What stuck was a punk band called World Inferno Friendship Society, which I joined as a keyboardist and then an accordion player. They were the first group that really took me on tour, that introduced me, my first American tour, my first European tour, my first band that people really cared about, and that I was able to be a part of growing. I founded a group called Antisocial Music, which was a composer-performer collective, and now is a funding organization for new music,
wow.
chamber music. I had a group called Guignol, which was a Balkan jazz band. And eventually I joined this group, the Hold Steady, when they were a relatively new band. And again, was sort of on that rocket ship from relatively small shows to quite large shows.
Right.
Did that for 5 years, very intense years. Left the band to do. I was a hired gun with a punk band called hired touring gun with a punk band called Against Me for a year. Did 5 years of solo touring as a songwriter act all around the world.
Wow.
Came off the road, as I said, in 2013 and 14 when my daughter was born, and sort of reinvented myself as a writer and teacher before slowly dipping my toe back into the Hold Steady water in 2016. And I've been back in that band since then.
Great. And so where do you fit in that band context? Where do you see yourself having, been there from virtually the beginning, but then having had a break?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it now as I've been a member of the Hold Steady for 20 years. I just took a little break for a couple of years in the middle.
Yeah.
I think that's the best way to think. It feels like a continuity.
Right.
Which is easy to say in retrospect, but I think looking back, that's how I would talk about it.
Right. Okay. And to wrap us up, firing. You had a small section in the book on that. I mean, how does that happen? Why does that happen? People don't think about it in the context of music, but it does.
Yeah, of course. It's like any other job. I mean, I think one of the takeaways from the book, you talked about it being aromantic, but I think if I want people to have any takeaway from it, it's about thinking of being in a band as being analogous to other kinds of jobs.
Right.
Where you have workplace colleagues, you have opportunities for individual creativity, but they have to be subsumed into the group project.
Yeah.
Right. So I've had people who work on graphic design teams talk about how much they identified with it. I've talked about people who work on architects talk about how they identified with it. And of course, any part of a working life includes losing your job.
Yeah.
And, that can manifest in all kinds of ways. One of the questions I was asking people is, when you have conflicts with other musicians, did it tend to be about music? Were they musical conflicts or personal conflicts? And, Michael Bland, drummer, said, is stage volume a musical conflict or a personal conflict?
Good question.
Which somebody on Twitter quoted when Jane's Addiction had their onstage fight recently, because apparently Perry Farrell was mad that Dave Navarro wouldn't turn his guitar amp down. That's the sort of thing. Like if you're having a personal conflict with someone, that can manifest as a creative conflict, right? Or vice versa. These things, like anyone who has friends or has a romantic partnership.
Yes,
like these things bubble under and are sort of deflected onto
it's usually not
things.
A fight about, the temperature in the room. There's some underlying, there's something else going on.
Yeah, or sometimes it's purely economic. I mean, Brian Viglione talked about being fired by the Violent Femmes just because they got a new manager who was like, hey, you don't have to pay this guy that much. We can get a cheaper drummer.
Yeah.
And they offered him a huge pay cut, and he was like, no.
Wow.
And that was that.
That was kind of a firing by proxy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, hey, take it or leave it. I guess I'll leave it.
Yeah.
People get fired for stuff like missing bus call or missing lobby call or, being too drunk to play, obviously.
Yeah.
There's power struggles. People know those tend to be pretty well documented. People know about those. It can happen in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. Where does a manager fit into a band? And when a band brings in a manager, I mean, Brian Epstein is a famous example with the Beatles. How does it change the dynamic in that the logistics are covered by somebody else and it becomes more about the musicianship?
Yeah, I had a lot of material about managers. I think I cut a lot of it. Because it wasn't directly relevant to how bands operate internally necessarily. But management, it depends on the band. Some people like to use management to try, as some people like to make decisions internally with the band and then communicate those decisions to management to execute. Some people like to have management be go-between between band members. In a lot of cases where there's a band leader who's hiring, let's say, a touring band, the band leader will, they can deflect the money talk onto management in a way that's convenient for everyone.
Yeah.
Right. And doesn't sully that relationship.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I want you to come on tour. My manager's going to call you and talk about the specifics.
Shop, yeah.
It really depends on how a band wants to run. Management can be the bad cop. That's a really useful role for management in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. So, well, how can people find out more about you?
Yeah, franznicolay.com, FranzNicolay.com has all the information you can need about the music, the writing, the teaching. I have a Substack, pianofighter.substack.com. I'm on the social media and all the usual places. But yeah, franznicolay.com is the one-stop shop.
All right, and the book is called Band, People, Life and Work in Popular Music. Franz, thank you for having me a guest in your home, and thanks for being a guest on the show.
Thanks for having me.